Hello again, travelers through time. Welcome back to another exciting episode of US History Understanding this Country. If you are just hopping on the wagon, a big warm welcome. And if you have been journeying with me for a while, thank you for being part of this adventure. Every follow, rating, and share helps fuel our travels. So if you are enjoying these stories, please take a moment to support the show. It really makes a difference. Now, today's episode is packed with energy and change because we are stepping into one of the most transformative times in American history, the age of reform. This was a time when cities were swelling with immigrants, tensions were rising, and everywhere you looked, people were asking, can we make life better? From fighting alcoholism to reforming prisons and schools to daring dreams of perfect communities, America was buzzing with ideas. It was also the era where abolitionists risked everything to end slavery and when women began demanding a rightful place in the society. Today, we have a story of passion, protest, and powerful belief that a nation, no matter how young or flawed, could be better if enough people stood up and tried. Let's dive in into the noisy streets, the crowded churches, the underground meetings, and the heart of reformers who dreamed bigger than the world they lived in. Welcome to the Age of Reform. Now, to understand why the Age of Reform caught fire the way it did, we first need to look at the changing face of America itself. By the early to mid 1800s, America wasn't just growing in size, it was growing in people. And a lot of those people were arriving not from other parts of the US, but from across the Atlantic Ocean. Immigration during this time exploded. Thousands upon thousands of new faces arrived at American ports every year, bringing with them new languages, traditions, and hopes, but also fears, challenges, and clashes. One of the largest groups to arrive were the Irish. In the 1840s, Ireland was struck by a devastating disaster, the Great Irish Famine, sometimes called the Potato Famine. A fungus wiped out the potato crops, which were the main food source for millions of Irish families. Starvation swept across the country. Within just a few years, over a million Irish men, women, and children fled their homeland, boarding crowded, often dangerous ships in desperate hope that America would offer something their homeland could not: survival. But the Irish weren't the only ones seeking a new beginning. Others crossed the ocean to escape religious persecution, especially those facing anti Catholic discriminations in parts of Europe. In America, they hoped to find a place where they could worship freely without fear of violence or prejudice. Another major group were Germans. Political unrest swept across German states in the 1840s. Failed revolutions, economic struggles, and the social upheaval pushed many Germans to look westward. These immigrants often came with a variety of skills. Some were farmers, others were craftsmen, teachers, or even political thinkers who carried with them big dreams about freedom, democracy, and community life. By the 1850s, cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia had thriving immigrant neighborhoods. New communities blossomed in places like Cincinnati, Milwaukee, and St. Louis. In many ways, these immigrants were building the physical foundations of America's growing cities, laying bricks, opening shops, digging canals, and planting farms. Now, as America's cities swell with new energy, new businesses, and new cultures, not everyone was celebrating. With each ship that docked bringing Irish families escaping famine or German immigrants seeking fresh beginnings, a different kind of fear began to grow among many native born Americans. A fear that the country they knew was changing too fast and maybe even slipping away from them. This fear, this fear gave rise to a powerful emotional backlash known as nativism. Nativists believed that the United States should be preserved for people born on American soil, especially for white Protestants of English descent. They viewed immigrants, particularly Catholic immigrants from Ireland and Germany, with deep suspicion. They feared that these newcomers would bring foreign ideas, loyalty to pop instead of American democracy, and cheap labor that threatened American jobs. And this wasn't just grumbling over tea, it turned political. In the 1850s, A secretive political movement rose from the dust of these fears. The Know Nothing Party, officially called the American Party. Its members earned their nickname because when asked about their activities, they would reply, I know nothing. The Know Nothings pushed hard for policies that would make life harder for immigrants. They wanted to extend the waiting period for naturalization, the process by which immigrants would become American citizens. They hoped to deny immigrants the right to vote or hold public office until they had lived in the country for many years, sometimes proposing decades long waiting periods. At their peak, the Know Nothings had real political power, winning elections in cities and even capturing entire state governments. Their rise showed just how anxious and divided America could become when faced with waves of changes. As the waves of immigration kept pouring in, America's cities didn't just grow, they exploded. By the mid 1800s, city life was transforming at a breathtaking pace. Places like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago were no longer just trading hubs or sleepy towns. They were becoming crowded, noisy, chaotic urban jungles. Imagine it, horse drawn carriages clogging muddy streets, merchants shouting their prices in a dozen different accents, factory whistles blowing at dawn, and entire neighborhoods pulsing with life and energy. Cities offered opportunity, jobs, excitement, new beginnings, but they also brought incredible challenges. Overcrowding became a major problem. There simply wasn't enough housing to keep up with the booming population. And that's when a new kind of living situation took over the landscape, something called the tenement. Tenements were cramped, cheaply built apartment buildings designed to pack as many people as possible into the smallest space imaginable. Families often lived 4, 5, even 6 people to a single tiny room. There was little ventilation, no proper sanitation, and fire hazards were everywhere. Disease spread quickly in the close quarters, and poverty was a constant suffocating reality. Yet, despite the hardships, life in the city was filled with resilience and creativity. Immigrant communities built churches, opened shops, published newspapers in their native languages, and created vibrant cultural pockets like Little Italy, Chinatown, and the Irish Wards. City life was tough, no doubt about it, but it was also a place where dreams could still flicker to life, even in the darkest corners. And while the city swelled with workers and children ran barefoot through crowded alleys, a different kind of transformation was happening too. A transformation not in streets and buildings, but in hearts and souls. This was the Second Great Awakening, a massive religious revival that touched millions of Americans in the early to mid 1800s. But this awakening wasn't just about filling church pews or building more chapels. It was something deeper. It challenged traditional Protestant views, which had often emphasized predestination, the idea that person's fate was sealed by God before they were even born. Instead, revival preachers spread a radical new message that every individual had the power to choose salvation. Faith wasn't a cold, predetermined contract, it was a personal, living relationship with God. And it came with responsibility. Religion became more emotional, more heartfelt. Tent revivals, huge outdoor gatherings popped up everywhere, from New York's burned over district to the rural frontiers of Kentucky. People sang, wept, shouted prayers, and found community in shared belief. Faith wasn't just something you inherited, it was something you felt and lived. But maybe the most important lesson of the Second Great Awakening was this: it taught Americans that if you could change your own soul, you could and you should try to change the world too. This wave of personal responsibility gave rise to a brand new energy, an energy that said, if we can make ourselves better, we can make our society better. It lit a fire under reformers, activists, and ordinary citizens alike. And with that spirit burning bright, a series of powerful movements would soon follow. Movements that would try to tackle everything from alcohol abuse to education, from prisons to the right of workers. As we moved deeper into the mid 1800s, It's clear that America wasn't just growing outward with new lands and cities. It was growing inward too, grappling with its conscience, challenging its habits, and asking big questions about how society should be. This was a time when ordinary people, shopkeepers, teachers, ministers, workers, everyone looked around and said, hmm, we can do better. One of the first big movements to catch fire was the Temperance Movement, an effort to slow down or even stop the heavy drinking that was so common in American life at the time. Led by reformers like Francis Willard, temperance advocates believed that alcohol was more than just a personal choice, it was a public crisis. They argued that excessive drinking led to poverty, broken families, crime, and wasted lives. Their message was simple: if people could control their drinking, they could reclaim their dignity and society would be stronger for it. Now, not everyone agreed. Some folks felt that banning alcohol was an attack on personal freedom. But for many reformers, temperance wasn't about control. It was about hope, about giving families a better shot at stability. At the same time, reformers turned their eyes towards America's prison system, a system that frankly was brutal and broken. Leaders like Dorothea Dix and Louis Dwight fought hard to change the way prisoners were treated. They argued that prisons shouldn't be just to be warehouses for punishment. They should be places for rehabilitation, places where people could be given a second chance. Dix, in particular, exposed the horrifying truth that many people suffering from mental illness were locked away in filthy prisons with no care at all. Thanks to voices like hers, new asylums were built, prison conditions slowly improved, and more humane approach to justice began to take root. And then there was the fight for education reform. Championed by leaders like Horace Mann and Henry Bernard, the education reform movement declared something radical for its time: that education should be a right, not a privilege. Before this era, good education was mostly reserved for the wealthy. Mann and others believed that if America truly wanted to be a democracy, a place where every person mattered, then every child, rich or poor, deserved a chance to learn, grow, and shape their own future. Thanks to their efforts, the idea of common school, free, publicly funded school, began to spread, laying the groundwork for American public school system we know today. But some reformers weren't content with just fixing parts of the society, they wanted to reimagine the whole thing. Across the country, small groups set out to create utopian communities, places where people could live together in harmony, sharing property, work, and ideals. One famous example was Brook Farm. Founded in 1844 just outside Boston, residents there dreamed of balancing manual labor with intellectual and artistic pursuits, basically working the land in the morning and reading poetry by afternoon. Most of these utopias eventually fell apart, sometimes because of financial troubles, sometimes because human nature got in the way. But they revealed a powerful truth. People were willing to dream boldly about a better world. And finally, as factories churned and railroads stretched across the land, workers began raising their voices too. The workers' rights movement emerged to confront the grim realities of industrial life: long hours, dangerous conditions, and miserable pay. Laborers, including women and children, often worked 12 to 16 hours a day with little protection. Groups like the Knights of Labor and leaders like Mother Jones, Mary Harris fought for fairer treatment, shorter workdays, safer workplaces, and a living wage. They didn't always win. In fact, early labor struggles were often crushed harshly, but they planted seeds that would eventually grow into the labor protections many workers rely on today. Each of these movements, whether it was about alcohol, prison, schools, or workers, had a common thread. They were about believing that change was possible even when the odds looked long. These reforms didn't fix every problem, far from it, but they showed a spirit that still runs deep through American history. The stubborn belief that even an imperfect nation can keep reaching for something better. As the age of reform swept across America, no cause burned hotter or cut deeper than the fight to end slavery. This movement was called abolitionism. And it wasn't just about changing laws, it was about challenging the very soul of the nation. Slavery had existed in America for 2 centuries by this time. Enslaved African Americans worked under brutal conditions, denied freedom, dignity, and basic human rights. Though northern states had mostly abolished slavery by early 1800s, it remained deeply entrenched in the South, where enslaved people fueled the cotton economy. But now, a new generation of Americans, both black and white, stood up and said, "No more." Abolitionists came from many walks of life. Some were former enslaved people, like Frederick Douglass, who used their own life stories to expose the cruelty of slavery. Douglass's speeches and writings opened millions of eyes to human cost of this injustice. Others, like William Lloyd Garrison, founded newspapers like The Liberator, demanding immediate emancipation, not someday, not gradually, but right now. Garrison's language was fiery and unapologetic, shocking many readers who had grown comfortable with compromise. There were also countless lesser known heroes, black and white, men and women, who organized meetings, circulated petitions, raised money, and gave their time, energy, and safety to the cause. And the movement wasn't just about words. Some abolitionists took direct action, helping enslaved people escape to freedom through secret networks that we will talk about shortly, the Underground Railroad. But abolitionism wasn't easy. It was dangerous. Speaking out against slavery in the 1830s and 40s could cost you your reputation, your business, even your life. Abolitionists were often harassed, attacked, and even killed. Yet they kept going because they believed that no nation that called itself free could continue to hold people in chains. And for those brave souls escaping slavery and those risking everything to help them, freedom was not just a dream, it was a journey. Running for freedom meant risking everything, your life, your family, and even lives of those willing to help you. And yet, thousands tried and thousands made it. Helping them along the way was a secret, shadowy network known as the Underground Railroad. Despite its name, the Underground Railroad wasn't a real railroad. There were no tracks, no trains. It was a series of safe houses and hidden paths, secret codes and brave hearts, an invisible system stretching from the southern plantations all the way to the free states of the north, and sometimes even into Canada. The people who risked everything to help escaping enslaved individuals were called conductors, and their homes or businesses were known as stations. Conductors guided fugitives from one safe place to another, often moving under the cover of darkness through forests, swamps, and backroads. Perhaps the most famous conductor was Harriet Tubman, herself an escaped enslaved woman. Tubman returned to the South again and again, risking capture and death each time, and personally led over 70 people to freedom. She never lost a single passenger. But Harriet wasn't alone. The Underground Railroad was made up of thousands of ordinary people, black and white, rich and poor, working in secret to defy the laws of their time and answer to a higher sense of justice. Messages were often sent in code. A lantern hanging on a certain windowsill might mean it was safe to approach. Songs sung in the fields carried hidden directions, songs like Follow the Drinking God, which pointed to the Northern Star, the ultimate guide to freedom. Escaping on underground railroads was brutally hard, traveling hundreds of miles on foot, hiding in barns, forests, even under hay in wagons. Every moment carried the risk of capture, and yet, against all odds, many made it. The Underground Railroad was more than a path to freedom. It was a symbol of courage, of solidarity, of ordinary people standing together quietly but bravely against an unjust system. But of course, not everyone saw the abolitionists or Underground Railroad with admiration. For every person risking their life to end slavery, there were others who were just as determined to keep the system exactly as it was. The truth is, abolitionism faced fierce opposition, not only in the South, where slavery was the backbone of the economy, but even parts of the North, where many people who claimed to oppose slavery still feared what abolition might bring. In the South, slavery wasn't just seen as an institution, it was seen as a way of life, a foundation of the economy, and even by some as a social necessity. Plantation owners, politicians, and everyday citizens defended slavery passionately. They argued that it was protected under the Constitution. Some even twisted religious texts to justify that, claiming it was part of a natural order. Southern leaders warned that ending slavery would collapse the economy, destroy families, and unleash chaos. Newspapers, preachers, and politicians worked hard to paint abolitionists as dangerous radicals who wanted to tear the society apart. But opposition wasn't limited to the South. Even in the northern cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, many people viewed abolitionists with suspicion. Why? Part of it was economic fear. Northern industries were tied to southern cotton. Part of it was radical prejudice. Many white Northerners supported ending slavery but didn't necessarily believe in equality. There was no fear that freeing millions of enslaved people would lead to competition for jobs, housing, and political power. Race riots broke out in northern cities. Abolitionist speakers were sometimes mobbed, attacked, or shouted down. Anti abolitionist propaganda warned of social disorder if slavery ended. In short, abolitionists were fighting not against just a system, but against a whole society built on fear, profit, and deeply ingrained prejudice. And yet, despite the threats, despite the attacks, despite the overwhelming pressure, they kept going. Because for those who believed in the cause of freedom, standing still simply wasn't an option. As the 1800s marched on and reform movements caught fire across America, another fight for justice was rising, this time led by women who were no longer willing to be pushed to the sidelines. This was the beginning of the women's rights movement. For centuries, women had been expected to live in the background, raising families, managing homes, and leaving politics, education, and law to men. But women weren't blind to the reforms happening around them. Many were already deeply involved in abolitionism and temperance, speaking at meetings, organizing campaigns, and fundraisings. And they noticed something. While they were fighting to free others, they themselves were still not free. They couldn't vote. They had very few rights over their own property. If they worked, their wages legally belonged to their husbands or fathers. In the eyes of the law, a married woman was barely separate from her husband. And so, a new group of reformers turned their focus inward toward women's equality. Two towering figures in this early movement were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Both Stanton and Mott were active in abolitionism, but after being barred from speaking at an anti slavery convention in London simply because they were women, they realized fighting for freedom had to begin with fighting for their own rights too. In 1848, they organized what would become the first major public gathering for women's rights in American history, the Seneca Falls Convention. It was here that Stanton, Mott, and their supporters unveiled a bold new document, the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions. Modeled after the Declaration of Independence, it declared that all men and women are created equal and listed the injustices women suffered under American law and society. It was a powerful radical moment, one that called not just for better treatment but for women's right to vote. Other leaders quickly joined the cause. Lucy Stone, one of the first American women to earn a college degree, became a dynamic speaker for women's rights and abolition. She kept her maiden name after marriage, a small act that spoke volumes at the time. And then there was Susan B. Anthony, a name many of us know today. She became one of the most relentless organizers of the movement, traveling the country, founding societies, giving speeches, and later helping secure women's right to vote through sheer force of will and endless hard work. Together, these women and countless others, whose name history sometimes forgets, began the movement that could ripple across centuries. But even as these brave voices called for change, a storm was gathering on the horizon. The nation was growing more divided by the day. Debates over slavery, expansion, and states' rights were pulling America apart at the seams. North and South eyed each other with suspicion. Compromises were crumbling, and soon words would no longer be enough. The country was racing towards its greatest trial of the time, the Civil War. In our next episode, we will step into the deepening sectional crisis, the last desperate attempts to hold the Union together, and the sparks that would ignite a full scale conflict. Until then, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and remember history isn't just about big battles, it's about the voices that dare to dream bigger. I'll see you next time on US History Understanding This Country. Bye.